The joint subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Deutsch, and Ranking Member Sears for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members for their 1-minute statements should they seek recognition. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record. Members may have 5 days in which to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. And Mr. Deutsch is in another committee. He's finishing up there, and as soon as he finishes, if we're already on the witnesses, we will yank you out of that microphone. No, we will just briefly interrupt so he can make his opening statement. So thank you, Chairman Salmon, who chairs our Western Hemisphere subcommittee, and thank you to Ranking Member Sears, who's the ranking member on that subcommittee. And the chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. I came into Congress in 1989 and was here 19 years ago when the AMIA attack occurred in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1994. Fast forward to today, and the Iranian presence in Latin America is on the rise and poses a greater threat to our national security. 2 months ago, the special prosecutor for AMIA, Alberto Nisman, released a 500-page report citing extensive evidence of Iran's intelligence and terrorist network alive and well in various Latin American nations. This report reaffirmed that Iran continues to use its diplomatic and cultural centers as a facade to infiltrate the region. As our 2 subcommittees continue to do our due diligence and shine the spotlight on the Iranian presence in the Western Hemisphere, it is important to examine this problem through the prism of the Obama administration's failed policies in Latin America. Time and again, we have seen the Obama administration fail to hold oppressive regimes accountable for the human rights violations, constitutional violations, and a breakdown of rule of law in the region. The ALBA nations of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Bolivia, and to a certain extent now, sadly, Argentina, continue to undermine U.S. efforts in the region, and it is not surprising that those same countries have opened up their arms to embrace the Iranian regime. Just yesterday, the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa held a hearing on the Iran-Syria nexus, and Ambassador John Bolton stated, and I quote, "The largest Iranian diplomatic facility in the world is in Caracas, Venezuela, because they are laundering their money through the Venezuelan banks," end quote. In order for the Obama administration to get serious about this issue, it cannot ignore the close ties between Venezuela and Iran. But it has become abundantly clear that the administration continues to put politics over national security. To admit that there is a problem in the hemisphere regarding Iran, the administration would first have to put the blame on the Venezuelan regime, the same regime that it continues to attempt to normalize relations with. The decision is misguided and would only embolden the corrupt Venezuelan leadership. 1 month ago, the Department of State presented to Congress a report on the Iranian influence in Latin America, and we thank our colleague for passing a bill making that possible, a report that was required thanks to the efforts of Mr. Duncan. Our responsibility as policymakers is to do our best to prevent problems from becoming even worse. We cannot wait until this threat increases to such a level that it cannot be contained, so we must be proactive and not reactive. That is why I was extremely disappointed that the report failed to reach its objectives required by U.S. law and failed to connect the dots on what is really going on in the hemisphere with Iran. The report lacked a coherent and detailed strategy on what the Department of State and other federal agencies are doing to combat the Iranian threat in our region, and drastically underestimated that threat. For example, the report states that the U.S. intelligence community works with our allies in the region to collect information on Iranian activities. What it failed to mention is the fact that there is a large intelligence gap within our own intelligence community to gather accurate information on Iranian activities, and this administration has failed to appropriately address this threat. In March of this year, the commander of Southcom testified before Congress and said, and I quote, I would be remiss, however, if I did not share with the Congress my assessment that the U.S. Southern Command's limited intelligence capabilities may prevent our full awareness of all Iranian and Hezbollah activities in the region, end quote. This is why I offered an amendment to the NDAA this year that authorizes the Secretary of Defense to deploy assets, personnel, and resources to the Joint Interagency Task Force South in coordination with Southcom to combat narco-terrorism and the Iranian threat in the region. The links between terrorism and drug trafficking are well known, which is why it is easy to assume why the Iranian regime and its proxies are in our hemisphere that continues to battle drug trafficking. What this administration fails to comprehend is that terrorists fighting in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iran, in Yemen, in Lebanon, are financing their illicit activities from drug trafficking proceeds being collected from right here in our own region. Whether it's the foiled plot by an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps member to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. and U.S. soil, or the DEA-led investigation into the Lebanese-Canadian bank and Operation Titan, it is clear that the Iranian regime is supporting operatives in our region. So it is in our national security interest to dismantle these transnational criminal organizations, and we cannot and must not turn a blind eye to this imminent threat. And with that, I am pleased to yield for his opening statement to Ranking Member Sears.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. This month marked the 19 years anniversary of the AMIA Jewish Community Center bombing in Buenos Aires, which killed 85 people. 2 years earlier, in March of 1992, a car bomb exploded in front of the Israeli embassy in the same city, killing 30 people and injuring 242. In both occasions, Hezbollah, along with Iranian officials, were implicated by Argentine authorities in what today remains amongst the most devastating terrorist attack Latin America has experienced. Tragic still is the fact that today justice remains elusive, all of which makes a joint truth commission between Argentina and Iran to review the case a puzzling proposition that does more to pour salt over the wounds of the victims' families than seek justice. In recent years, pervasive anti-Americanism fueled Iran's relationship with countries like Bolivia, Cuba, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. The leftist leaders of the so-called ALBA group and Iran's Ahmadinejad found favor and ideological kinship with each other. Their regional encounters, often led by former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, involved the announcement of improbable joint ventures and U.S. antagonism. Nevertheless, these relationships beg the question of their underlying intent. On one side has been an Iran whose support of terrorism, international disregard, and nuclear ambition has been an imminent threat to the global community. On the other are several regional state actors whose leaders have exhibited a disregard for democratic principles and the goal of reducing U.S. influence in the region. U.S. intelligence officials have noted that the crippling effect of sanctions against Iran and attempts to defy the international community gave way to an outreach effort within the hemisphere to reduce its international isolation. For the ALBA bloc of nations, their associations with Iran has provided shallow yet symbolic economic opportunities. Above all, it has given them an international platform to espouse anti-American rhetoric. While these interactions may be more about showmanship than brinkmanship, Iran's presence and activities in the hemisphere must not be taken lightly and should remain a security concern of the United States. For instance, a 2011 failed assassination attempt against the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. involved 2 Iranian nationals who sought the aid of Mexican drug cartels, reflecting a will by Iran to carry out an attack within the U.S. Moreover, the State Department's 2012 report on terrorism noted that while there were no known operational cells of either Hezbollah or al-Qaeda in the hemisphere, there remain ideological sympathizers providing financial support in areas like tri-border region of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. Partly for these reasons, Congress requested that the State Department submit an assessment of Iran's presence and activity in the Western Hemisphere. The mostly classified report submitted to Congress late last month maintained that Iran influence in Latin America and the Caribbean is waning. Therefore, the purpose of this hearing today is to examine the State Department's determination. This hearing and the reports released come at the heels of various significant events that have the potential to change the course of Iran's presence and influence in the hemisphere. Venezuela President Hugo Chavez died in March, and last month Hassan Rouhani was elected to be Iranian's new president. It is uncertain as to whether Iran and Venezuela's new leaders will maintain the same level of interaction seen under Chavez. Additionally, Argentina's prosecutor Alberto Nisman recently released a scathing report on Iran's activities throughout Latin America. I remain skeptical of whether anything of substance is going to be achieved with the so-called Truth Commission. While I am deeply concerned about Iran's involvement in this hemisphere, particularly the financial and security on the financial and security front, I think it is imperative that as we move forward, we do so in a manner that does not set back our relations with our friendly neighbors. I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses about the State Department's determination of the Iranian threat and what directions our foreign policy should take in regards to the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Sears, for that great opening statement. And we're so pleased now to turn to the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, Mr. Salmon.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Chairman Ros-Lehtinen for joining me in convening today's hearing, and the witnesses who've taken the time to come before this joint hearing to share their thoughts on Iran's presence in the Western Hemisphere, how this presence may affect our national security, and whether the State Department's report provided Congress with an accurate picture of the potential threat. When the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act, which was sponsored by our great friend and representative from South Carolina, Jeff Duncan, last year, and passed in December of last year, there was a reasonable expectation that the State Department would draft a thorough and thoughtful report in response to legitimate concerns that Iran and its proxies maintain influence throughout our hemisphere. Unfortunately, the State Department delivered a dismissive report that lacked the depth and seriousness this very important national security issue warrants. The unclassified State Department report concluded that Iran's influence in the region is waning, and based on that assessment, based that assessment on several unfulfilled commercial agreements between Iran and some of the hemisphere's ALBA countries. Nowhere did the report consider what most security experts agree in Iran and its proxy Hezbollah's ability to slowly and methodically establish inroads necessary to launch acts of terrorism, as they did in Argentina while planning the 1994 bombing of the Argentine-Israelite Mutual Association. Therefore, citing the lack of an imminent Iranian or Hezbollah threat or anecdotal information that Iran has been unreliable after signing commercial agreements provides very little comfort to those dedicated to our nation's security. Moreover, the report failed to give proper consideration to the fact that the ALBA-aligned governments that have welcomed increased Iranian diplomatic presence over the past several years, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, have been undermining democratic institutions in their respective countries, creating exactly the type of environment complete with vitriolic anti-Americanism and a stranglehold on liberty that makes for ideal breeding ground for Iranian adventurism. As chairman of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere last week, I asked Assistant Secretary Jacobson to come to the Hill to answer the many questions my colleagues and I have about their dismissive report. I convened today's hearing jointly with Chairman Ros-Lehtinen to continue digging deeper into the nature of the threat posed by Iran and its proxies' presence so close to our homeland. The American people rightfully expect their representatives to take the security of our nation seriously. I'm confident that today's hearing will shed further light on the nature of Iran's presence in our hemisphere, and I want to once again thank our witnesses for coming forth with testimony on this matter of national security. Finally, Madam Chairman, I'd like to express a warm thank you to our subcommittee's summer interns. We have two of them, and they were phenomenal. Emily King and Eric Maroney, and yeah, thank you, yay. We really appreciate the great work that they've done. They brought with them an exceptional amount of professionalism, hard work, integrity, and we're just thrilled that they could work with us this summer, and I yield back the balance.
Nice. Thank you, Mr. Salmon. Now we're pleased to recognize members for their opening statements, and we'll begin with Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today. I very well remember 19 years ago when the Jewish Community Center of Buenos Aires was bombed. My interest at the time was perhaps heightened because I was then a young leader in the Jewish Community Center of Jewish community of Chicago. There were and continue to be very close ties between our communities, and we all share, as we do here, the same concern and disappointment that justice remains denied for the victims of Argentina. Let me jump forward to today. Last week, we were encouraged to see that the European Union acted to finally designate the military wing of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, a reality which the U.S. and many of our allies have known for years. Despite this designation, there is much work to be done. Hezbollah, and by extension Iran, continue to have global reach, which threatens U.S. interests and those of our close allies. We cannot let up on the pressure on the European Union until they agree to join the U.S. and others in a comprehensive sanctions regime that would stifle Hezbollah's global influence network. This hearing focuses on Hezbollah and Iran's influence here in the Western Hemisphere. Despite the low occurrence rate of terrorist attacks in our region, this international organization continues to use its network of local banks, gangs, and drug traffickers to launder money and finance regional destabilization efforts in the Middle East and elsewhere. I look forward to hearing from the panel on how the U.S. can best combat this international terrorism finance network and what steps we might take to pursue an all-inclusive sanctions regime. I thank the Chair for calling this hearings today, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. And now very pleased to recognize Mr. Duncan, who was the author and the passage of the bill of the Iran, calling for the report on Iran's presence in the Western Hemisphere was so successful. You were the only freshman to pass a bill? Felicidades.
So. Yeah, in this committee anyway.
In this, okay, you're recognized.
Thank you so much. It wouldn't have happened had it not been for the leadership of Chairman Ros-Lehtinen. And so I want to applaud her and Chairman Salmon for holding this joint subcommittee hearing today to examine the threat from Iran's actions in the Western Hemisphere and to assess the State Department's recent report to Congress. Earlier this month, as Chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee on the Homeland Security Committee, I held a hearing to examine the threat to the U.S. homeland from Iran's extending influence in the Western Hemisphere. All of the witnesses highlighted the activities of Iran and provided compelling evidence showing Iranian influence increasing rather than waning, as the State Department claims. Although Congress has held numerous hearings culminating in today's hearing, and although Congress passed bipartisan bicameral legislation that the President signed into law, the State Department's report to Congress was inadequate in its lack of rigorous evaluation conducted in a comprehensive and coordinated manner. I question the State Department's scope, methodology, and findings in its report to Congress, evidenced by the fact that the State Department did not reach out to even one ally or partner in this hemisphere to craft its assessment or strategy. The State Department also failed to consider all the evidence in the extensive 500-page report by General Prosecutor of the AMIA bombing, Alberto Nisman. Although Iran has publicly stated that promotion of all-out cooperation with Latin American countries is one of its top priorities, and among the definite and strategic policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, this administration refuses to see Iranian presence in the Western Hemisphere as a threat to U.S. security. Testimony from the Oversight Subcommittee hearing found that Iran has exemplified steady patience in building networks within the Western Hemisphere. Iran has penetrated countries through mosques, embassies, cultural centers, and recruited over 1,000 students in Latin America to travel to Iran for training. Iran is also possesses the ability to obtain fraudulent passport documentation and exploit free trade zones and loose border security measures. Iran's close cooperation with drug cartels and criminal networks in the region and expanding trade with countries like Argentina and Brazil should cause the administration to prove that to the American people that Iran's influence is actually waning rather than simply asserting it. Today, I, along with several members of Congress, including Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Chairman Royce and Chairman Salmon, sent a letter to Secretary Kerry requesting specific answers to questions that have not been answered. I ask that this letter be submitted into the record.
Without
I look forward to,
objection.
thank you, Madam Chairman. I look forward to the State Department's response in a timely manner. I also expect that the GAO to examine this issue in depth, and I look forward to their report in the coming months. And I'll finish my comments with just saying, in the written testimony of Mr. Levitt, he mentions that 300 Lebanese were smuggled into this country in the car, in the trunk, and I hope you'll mention this in your testimony, but in the trunk of his car across the Mexican border into this country. We can't ignore this issue, that Iran is a threat, and there's a possibility that by saying that it's waning and taking our eye off the ball, we could be a target and could result in implications and further complications. So with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duncan. Mr. Vargas is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would also like to thank the respective chairs and ranking members of each subcommittee for this timely hearing and for the opportunity to speak here today. I want to express my deep concern regarding Iran's growing presence and influence in the Western Hemisphere. As the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism, Iran's network of proxies and syndicates have conducted terrorist attacks, such as the 2 bombings in Argentina in 1992 and 1994, and they continue to expand their reach in the region. Of particular concern are Iran's efforts to develop ties with Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua, trying to circumvent U.S. and UN sanctions meant to isolate them from the international community. Iranian officials have declared an all-out cooperation with Latin American countries and have invested heavily in mosques, embassies, cultural centers, and student recruitment in Latin America, trying to seek favor. We must do all we can to stop Iranian influence in our hemisphere. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today, and I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Shabbat is recognized, the chairman of the, what is the name of your subcommittee?
Asia and the Pacific.
That's it. That's a big chunk of land.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen and Chairman Salmon, I want to thank both of you for calling this hearing. Iran's threat to the U.S. is no secret. Iran's deep-rooted linkages to rogue regimes around the world and those countries that are fixated on propagating anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism are very real and must be taken seriously. Its ties to Syria threaten the stability of the entire Middle East, and similarly, its support to North Korea is destabilizing Asia. As we will discuss this afternoon, Iran's growing influence in Latin America and throughout the Western Hemisphere is just as dangerous. The administration's report on Iranian influence in the Western Hemisphere is troubling because saying that Iran's influence is waning disregards the real facts. It mistakes the trees for the forest. Tehran has developed a broad network through its Hezbollah proxy and relationships with local criminal organizations to support an extensive strategy that promotes terrorist activities. This report does not show that we are doing enough to deter Iranian-sponsored terrorist acts. Yesterday, the Nuclear Iran Prevention Act was passed on the House floor, which is an important step in dramatically increasing the pressure on Iran to halt its nuclear ambitions and cut off its money laundering schemes in the region. The question is, what do we do next? I look forward to hearing the testimonies of our distinguished witnesses here this afternoon, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Chairman Shabbat. Mr. Meeks is there. Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Sorry. Albio's a big guy. I did not see you there.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to thank you and Chairman Salmon for convening this hearing today to examine the security of our southern neighbors. And there is no doubt that there are nefarious elements in the region that need to be countered. Specifically, Iran and Hezbollah's interests and activities in the Western Hemisphere are troubling and should be diligently countered by a robust and proactive United States foreign policy. International criminal networks connected by Hezbollah greatly threaten the security of the United States and undermine our efforts to promote stability and democracy in the region and around the world. We're here today to talk about what findings that the State Department had. I wish we had a state, and maybe we do need a hearing where the State Department is here also, so that we could hear a full and complete report as to what's taking place, what the State Department found, how they found it, what kind of information they obtained, as opposed to just dismissing it and going with some other place where I don't know whether they have. I've had some hearings and some meetings, I should say, some classified in regards to, and I can't talk about all of those things here, but the State Department should have a seat here so that we could have them answer some questions and they can tell you specifically what they found, how they found it, and why they found it, as opposed to just making a presumption that their report just means nothing and all of these things are going on. I think that we need to do a more holistic finding and a holistic type of hearing where we can then really get into the facts and not just fan fire when we don't know whether it is or not. So I think that it'd be fair to have both sides here, or have everyone here, so that everybody could hear all of the facts, all of the circumstances, and we then know which the direction that we should head in. I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Meeks, and we will be glad to have you co-sign a letter that I routinely send to the State Department. We've been begging for 3 years to have them come testify. We would be pleased and honored to have you join us in that bipartisan effort.
I love it. I know every time we've had a classified meeting, we've asked, they've been here and been willing to give us that information.
They always do, classified, but never open. Thank you so much, Mr. Meeks. We'll turn that over to you. Ms. Meng, so pleased to recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Yesterday, we passed H.R. 850, strengthening Iran's sanctions. But this does not mean we can head off to our August work periods feeling content with our efforts on the Iranian question. The Iranian regime is smart and swift, and when we push it down in one area, it rises in another. That is why we must adopt a comprehensive diplomatic push against Iran. In Latin America, for example, the Iranian regime is seeking to circumvent its isolation and the sanctions directed against it. We're leading opposition to the Iran-Argentina Truth Commission, which is a sham, quote-unquote, re-investigation of the '94 Buenos Aires bombing, despite Iran's clear culpability for this atrocious attack. I look forward to hearing from our panelists today on these important questions. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And now we're pleased to introduce our witnesses. First, we welcome Dr. Matthew Levitt, Senior Fellow and Director of the Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dr. Levitt has served a long and distinguished career working to counter international terrorism, having served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Treasury from 2005 to 2007, and prior to this, at the FBI as a counterterrorism intelligence analyst. Thank you for your service, Dr. Levitt. Next, we will welcome Mr. Michael Brown, who in 2008 retired from the Drug Enforcement Agency as Chief of Operations Assistant Administrator after serving a 33-year domestic international law enforcement career. During this time, he used his expertise in the confluence of drugs and terror to lead the DEA's expansion in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2008, and served as Chief of Staff for the Minister of the Interior Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. Mr. Brown is a Vietnam veteran, like my hubby, having served enlisted in the Marines in '71 as an infantryman. Hoorah. Then we welcome Mr. Eric Farnsworth. Did I do okay? Thank you. Vice President of the Council of the Americas and America Society. Mr. Farnsworth is an expert in various issues affecting U.S. relations in the Western Hemisphere, including economic development, trade, energy, security, and democracy. He has served in various government positions involving Western Hemisphere and trade issues, including at the State Department's Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and as a senior advisor to the White House Special Envoy for the Americas during the Clinton administration. We have quite a set of panelists here today. And gentlemen, we will begin with Dr. Levitt. We are about to vote, and unfortunately, we have a 3-vote series, and then 10 minutes for motion to recommit, and then 7 votes after that. So we'll be gone a while. Make yourself comfortable. We'll start with Dr. Levitt.
Thank you so much. Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Siris. It's distinguished members of both subcommittees. It's an honor to appear before you this afternoon to discuss Iran's presence in the Western Hemisphere, and of course, it's an honor to share a dais anytime with Eric and Mike. On the one hand, the State Department's recent report on Iranian activity and influence in the Western Hemisphere played down Iran's activities in the region. On the other, the authors of the report themselves conceded in the unclassified annex to the report that some of their conclusions were actually based on certain assumptions. That's their word. One assumption noted that, and I quote, Iranian interest in Latin America is of concern. Yet another stated that as a result of U.S. and allied efforts, and I quote, Iranian influence in Latin America and the Caribbean is waning. In fact, Iran not only continues to expand its presence in bilateral relationships with countries like Cuba, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, but reportedly also maintains a network of intelligence agents specifically tasked with sponsoring and executing terrorist attacks in the Western Hemisphere. Iran and Hezbollah both have worked long and hard over many years to build up their presence and influence in Latin America. In my written testimony, I provide a good deal of background on Hezbollah and Iran's bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires 19 years ago last month. I included, for your reading pleasure, an excerpt on the AMIA bombing from my new book, and detailed Iran's role in the attack, including funding it, providing cover to operatives, using diplomats and front organizations, and more. But as it happens, the same day that the State Department released its controversial report, Alberto Nisman released his 500-page document laying out how the Iranian regime has, since the 1980s, built and maintained, and I quote, local clandestine intelligence stations designed to sponsor, foster, and execute terrorist attacks in the Western Hemisphere. Nisman found that Iran continues to build intelligence networks identical to the one responsible for the bombings in Argentina across the region, from Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, and Colombia, to Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and more. He concluded, and I quote, in other words, the AMIA bombing did not constitute an isolated event. The driving force behind Iranian activities in the region at the time of the AMIA bombing was Mohsen Rabbani, who reportedly continues to engage in Iranian intelligence work focused on the Western Hemisphere today. Nisman pointed to the trial of 4 men in the Eastern District of New York who plotted to bomb the JFK airport in 2007. Rabbani offered to help the men connect with Iranians. They sought technical and financial assistance from Iran for the operation, which was codenamed Chicken Farm. All 4 men were ultimately convicted in federal court. Documents seized from one of the co-conspirators' homes in Guyana demonstrated that he was a Rabbani disciple who built a Guyanese intelligence network for Iran, much like his mentor had built in Argentina. In 2011, not long before the last defendant in the JFK airport bomb plot was convicted, evidence emerged suggesting Rabbani was still doing intelligence work in South America. In the words of one Brazilian official, quote, without anybody noticing, a generation of Islamic extremists is appearing in Brazil. In addition to Nisman's reports, other branches of the U.S. government have reached very different conclusions from the State Department. This March, General Kelly from Southcom testified, and I quote, that members and supporters of Iran's partner, Lebanese Hezbollah, have established presence in several countries in the region. The Lebanese Shia diaspora in the region may generate as much as tens of millions of dollars for Hezbollah through both illicit and licit means. The U.S. Treasury Department, too, has thoroughly detailed Iranian activity in the Western Hemisphere in several recent designations in their press releases. And of course, these include bank sanctions for banks in Venezuela that are helping Iran evade sanctions, June 2002 designation of individuals involved in the drug kingpin network of Ayman Juma, who is tied to Hezbollah. Juma himself had been designated in January 2011, and more. Then there's Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's visit to Venezuela in January 2012, which seemed rather unremarkable beyond his normal inflammatory personality. But then, according to Western intelligence officials cited by ProPublica, a senior officer in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps secretly traveled with the presidential delegation to meet with Venezuelan military and security chiefs and to set up a joint intelligence program between Iranian and Venezuelan spy agencies. While the State Department's Iranian activity report downplayed Iran's activities in the hemisphere, the department's annual terrorism report separately noted a noticeable increase in Iranian activity in all other parts of the world. At least some of that activity has been here in the Western Hemisphere. Just last week, for example, 7 Iranians were caught using fake Israeli passports at the Vancouver International Airport. The growth of the Iranian extremist network in the Western Hemisphere has immediate repercussions for the security of the United States. The same day that Nisman and the State Department released their reports, an Iranian-American used car salesman from Texas was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his role in an Iranian plot to assassinate Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States. And the Director of National Intelligence assessed that that plot shows that some Iranian officials, probably including the Supreme Leader himself, have changed their calculus and are now more willing to conduct an attack in the United States in response to real or perceived U.S. actions threatening their regime. The bombing of the bus in Burgas a year ago last month was what spurred the European Union to even consider banning even just the military wing of Hezbollah. But that occurred on July 18th. 18 years ago, that was the same day of the bombing of the AMIA Center, which means that this hearing is well-timed indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Deutsch, and Series, honorable members of both subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very, very important hearing today on Iran's growing influence in the Western Hemisphere, Africa, Europe, and Asia, Mr. Chabot, and on the recent Department of State report that addresses the matter. It's hard to talk about what we don't know with respect to this threat. So let's focus on what we do know, some of which you've already talked about, but let me provide you a little bit more granularity that I think will be even more shocking to the statements that have already been made by many. So let's talk about the facts. Let's talk about the evidence that can and already has passed the judicial test in federal courthouses right here in the United States. Let's talk about the Hezbollah's growing involvement in the Western Hemisphere, in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. Iran's most important terrorist proxy, as you've said. And let's talk about the IRGC's Quds Force and what they've been up to more specifically, or most specifically, in the Western Hemisphere over just the past few years. Just about 18 months ago, as you've said, Quds Force operatives were attempting to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the U.S. right here in Washington, D.C. In fact, just a few blocks from the White House. They thought they were recruiting members of the ultra-violent Los Zetas drug cartel in Mexico, which should be shocking in and of itself. Fortunately, they were recruiting DEA operatives, and the DEA and the FBI foiled that plot. The Hezbollah, U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization, partially at least also designated by the EU now, is heavily involved and has grown heavily involved over the past few years in the global cocaine trade. And it is involved heavily at the center of gravity for that activity. The center of gravity has always been and always will be the Andean region of South America. And the transshipment routes that permeate and has been built over many years, encompassing the north coast of Colombia and Venezuela, the Isthmus of Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico. A growing number of international conspiracy investigations as a result of that activity by U.S. federal law enforcement paint an ominous picture of Hezbollah's presence in the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere. Just one dimension of just one DEA investigative effort against Hezbollah focuses on the money laundering aspect of their cocaine trafficking activities and resulted in the seizure of $150 million by the Departments of Treasury and Justice just about a year and a half ago. The Beirut-based Lebanese-Canadian bank, long known to be heavily influenced by the Hezbollah and their preferred go-to money laundering financial facility, just recently settled with the Department of Justice as a result of that action, and the bank has agreed to forfeit $102 million. The bank was sold about 2 weeks after the Patriot Act 311 sanctions against that organization that were a result of the DEA and DOJ investigations. A more granular example, and I think even more shocking though, is what's playing out again, at a lower level, at a treetop level. Congresswoman, as your husband would probably say, being a former Marine, at a treetop level, granular level, was the $20 million cash seizure made by the DEA and some foreign counterparts in Central America after a high-level Hezbollah associate actually delivered the bulk cash, $20 million, to an undercover DEA agent who was posing, who, by the way, spoke fluent Arabic and was posing as a money launderer. Remarkably, another $16 million was supposed to have been delivered within 48 hours. Unfortunately, that did not happen. The investigation was compromised, and I think is still being looked at. But suffice it to say that so much Hezbollah cocaine cash, bulk cash, was being amassed in Central America that they couldn't figure out how to move it back to Lebanon, or to move it to Lebanon. Evidence clearly shows that Hezbollah is involved in the same kinds of activity that I've just described in Central America, in Africa, and other locations, as my statement for the record states. If anyone thinks for a moment, because there is some inference in the Department of State report, that Hezbollah is on the rocks because they're reliant on funding from Iran. If anyone thinks for a moment that that's the case, they couldn't be further from, further from the truth. We have to look at things differently. It's the kind of criminal activity that I've just described above, by Hezbollah, Iran's most important proxy, and other terrorist organizations that make them organizationally and operationally sharp while they wait for the day of reckoning. It prepares them for war under very realistic conditions. It provides them with a real-world proving ground to continually test and refine their tactics, techniques, and procedures as they continue to probe and prod those of their adversaries, namely us. It is allowing them to prepare and shape the future battlefield right here at home. We need to somehow work harder at driving a wedge between these very powerful forces and keeping them separated. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Farnsworth.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Mr. Chairman and ranking members, also members of the subcommittees, for this opportunity. I join my colleagues in expressing appreciation, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify with them as well. The State Department's recent report on Iran's presence in the Americas, as has already been mentioned, reminds us that Iranian interest in Latin America is of concern. Of course, we're dealing with imperfect information that is by its very nature shrouded, much of it classified or even unknown. What remains clear is this, however. Nations in the Americas that disrespect democratic principles tend also to be nations that offer aid and comfort to global actors who reject the norms of the international system. The best example, of course, is Cuba, as you, Madam Chairman, and others, Mr. Series, have clearly mentioned over many years. And we've seen that again as highlighted by the discovery in July of missile and other weapons parts going through the Panama Canal intended for North Korea. It's also a fact that ungoverned regions within countries offer permissive environments for mischief-making, and a weak inter-American system offers little in terms of the ability to counterbalance extra-legal or threatening acts from outside the region. Those countries where democracy is challenged, where the institutions of the state are ineffective, or where democratically elected leaders have curtailed sound democratic practices for their own purposes, have proven to be the most likely portals through which unhelpful influences such as Iran are introduced into the region. Indeed, it was former Venezuelan President Hugo Chávez's intentional pursuit of Tehran and Tehran's simultaneous need for allies that brought the two nations closer together and encouraged Iran to develop deeper ties with Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua. Venezuela's aggressive efforts to midwife Iran's political and diplomatic entry into the Americas through reciprocal leaders' visits, trade and commercial agreements, including direct air links, and friendly votes in bodies such as the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Agency have been polarizing and counterproductive. The State Department report indicates that Iranian influence in Latin America and the Caribbean is waning. If so, in my view, that is largely due to the changing leadership matrix in the Americas and potentially in Iran itself, in addition to the actions by the United States and its regional allies that the report describes. It's certainly possible that the death of Chavez will diminish Latin Americans' appetite for Iran. It's also possible that despite the benefits to Iran that have clearly accrued from deepened relations in the Americas, the inauguration of new leadership in Iran may also diminish that country's interest in the Americas. Although support for Hezbollah's activities, particularly in fundraising and money laundering, as we've heard, will certainly continue. This is something we need to watch carefully. However, if the bilateral relationship has been institutionalized to the point that it outlasts both Chavez and the outgoing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and we've heard that it indeed is, it's also possible that a leader such as Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, in attempting to build his own international profile and authority as Chavez's rightful heir, may seek to develop the relationship further. This should be anticipated and steps taken in advance to limit the success of any such initiative. For the United States, several actions are therefore appropriate in order to inoculate the Hemisphere from further Iranian adventurism. First, we should continue to be watchful regarding Iranian influence in the Americas, while taking care not to act on incomplete information unnecessarily or to take steps precipitously. Communication and coordination with our friends and allies in these matters, particularly law enforcement entities, is critical, of course, as we work together to build an expected norm of responsible democratic behavior in the Hemisphere. Sanctions against offending individuals and entities should continue to be employed. Second, we should continue to emphasize the hemispheric growth agenda, including trade and investment expansion and the rule of law, which will help build strong and expanding middle classes and reinforce just, transparent societies that are less prone to authoritarian manipulations from elected leaders of any ideology. And finally, despite efforts to build democracy elsewhere around the world, the United States cannot be complacent about such matters closer to home. Democracy offers no guarantees, but we stand a much better chance of achieving our strategic goals in the hemisphere, including a peaceful, growing, vibrant region that works in tandem with us to address issues of common concern and rejects outside meddling, if democratic institutions in the Americas are strong. That requires doing the difficult work of democracy promotion, building institutions including separation of powers and electoral systems where the legitimate opposition has equal chance of contesting elections as government candidates do. It requires civic education efforts that inculcate democratic expectations among populations in order to reject the creeping authoritarianism that some democratic leaders have shown. It requires the United States to find its voice through more active and effective diplomacy to promote regional democracy. We need regional partners in this effort, but U.S. leadership will continue to be required. To the extent the United States is able to come alongside Latin America and the Caribbean to offer meaningful steps on a shared agenda, we will find that regional leaders may then reciprocate by becoming more actively engaged in support of U.S. priorities, one of which clearly must be to keep Iran and other malign influences out of the Western Hemisphere. So I want to thank you again, Madam Chairman, Mr. Chairman, ranking members for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And as a Cuban-born political refugee, I always say I never mind when I get interrupted by democracy at work. So with our deepest apologies, we have 1 minute and 47 seconds left to go vote. And if you could stick around and answer questions, we won't be back till about an hour and a half. Democracy is like making sausage. It's not pretty and it's long. So if you can't stick around, we would welcome you. If not, we'll ask one of you who can stick around. And with that, so I don't want to impose upon you because it will take a while. A series of votes and a motion to recommit. With that, our subcommittee will be adjourned, and we hope to hear also from Mr. Deutsch's opening statement when we return. All right. See you later. Hasta luego. The subcommittee will once again resume. We have Mr. Meeks. We thank you, sir, and Chairman Salmon. And so I will begin with my question. In the memo that we prepared for the members, it says here, Iran has 11 embassies in the Latin America and Caribbean region, and you have all mentioned that. Since 2005, it has opened embassies in Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Uruguay. This was in addition to existing Iranian embassies in Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, Mexico, and Venezuela. Former Southcom Commander General Douglas Frazier testified to Congress in March 2012 that Iran has 36 Shia cultural centers in 17 countries throughout Latin America. I think if more people in the United States knew this, they would be shocked, because usually embassies are there to process visas for folks who want to travel, along with many other things. Some have called our embassies islands of democracy, so I like that. Certainly that term cannot be applied to Iranian embassies. And I can't imagine that there are many Latin American citizens who, in and of themselves, would have decided, hey, I know where we should vacation. Let's take the kids and go to Iran. So one has to wonder, what are these 11 embassies in Latin America and the Caribbean region doing? And what are these 36 Shia cultural centers in 17 countries throughout Latin America doing? How good is our information on this? How many people are in these embassies or cultural centers? Because certainly they've got to be dens of plotting anti-American activities, anti-Semitic acts, and I wanted to ask our esteemed witnesses what your thoughts are about the Shia cultural centers, about the sponsored by Iran, and about the 11 embassies in Latin America and the Caribbean. We'll start with Dr. Levitt.
Thank you so much. The most honest and accurate answer to your question is we don't know, certainly in the open source. And my sense is that there's an intel gap, too, as to exactly how many people and exactly what are they up to. But there is precedent, and the precedent, while not necessarily giving us detailed answers for today, is telling. Again, if we go back to AMIA, we have detailed documentation of Iranian front companies, Iranian use of Iranian-built and funded mosques, of the cultural centers, of import-export companies, travel offices, all of which were put to use for either operational, logistical purposes or for espionage. Rabbani, for example, recruited a whole bunch of people in Argentina from within the Shia community. Others were Iranians who were employed at the embassy under diplomatic cover. He himself got diplomatic cover just weeks before the bombing. And some of these people were referred to by members of the community as his, that is to say, Iran's antennas, because it was well known that this is what they're doing. The real question for me also is not just the number, but in certain locations. I've been told that in certain locations, there's very large embassies completely out of proportion to Iran's business or other interests in the country, in some very small countries, and that is something that we need to be concerned about. So some of the suggestions I've offered to Congress before on this is, you know, Iranians are allowed into this country because of their diplomatic presence in New York, but their travel is severely limited. What they can do is severely limited. And we should be pressing our allies in South America to do the same. You don't necessarily have to shut down the Iranian diplomatic missions, but you do need to keep them to a certain size. We should convince them to limit their travel, limit the kind of meetings they can hold, because clearly there's stuff happening out of these facilities that goes above and beyond what would be considered normal diplomatic activity.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, ma'am. You know, what's going on, as Matt said, you know, we don't really know. What concerns me most, though, is the embassies, the cultural centers all provide cover, top cover for the growing presence of the Quds Force, the IRGC special forces that are responsible for foreign operations, clandestine operations, which include assassinations. We talked about that earlier with the recent attempt on the Saudi ambassador's to the U.S., his life here in Washington, D.C. What also worries me, and I lose sleep over this, is this concurrent growing presence of not just Quds Force, but again concurrently of Hezbollah all over Latin America, the Caribbean, and in some other parts of the world. You know, what exactly it means, you know, I'm not sure, but after 38 years in this business, it's not good. And I learned over many years to rely on my sixth sense, and my sixth sense again says, you know, this is a potentially, you know, a disaster that's looming over our head, and we'd better get serious about addressing it.
So you see a military tinge to this?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Farnsworth.
Well, just very briefly, it is curious that this increase in activity, increase in personnel, increase in connection, if you want to put it that way, has been fairly recent. I mean, Iran's relations in Western Hemisphere actually go back quite a ways because of agricultural links and energy links and all that. But what currently exists seems to far outweigh certainly the traditional relations that Iran has had in the region. And they do seem to have tracked with a certain political emphasis that the Iranians have had in the Western Hemisphere, largely, again, in my view, brought into the region in that way through the Chavez regime in Venezuela.
Very much, gentlemen. Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just ask, just out of curiosity, it seemed as though, and I know Mr. Farnsworth just said that they had this agriculture, et cetera, but it seemed like that Iran's activities in the Western Hemisphere really grew in 2005 with the election of Ahmadinejad. And is it likely that Iran's strategic objectives in the Western Hemisphere, I'm just throwing this up, will change, or you think it will be the same under this President Rouhani, which happens to, you know, and what happens to the relationship that Ahmadinejad may have fostered? Do you think that's going to change? Has it anything to do with Ahmadinejad, or do you think that, you know, the same kind of thing is going to continue?
First of all, while they might have increased under Ahmadinejad, the relationships go back to the 1980s, and especially agricultural issues, importing beef and chicken. And in fact, when the government of Argentina in the 1990s canceled a nuclear agreement with Iran because of concerns that Iran's nuclear program might not be peaceful, sounds familiar, Iran threatened to cut off all of this significant economic contact. But I worry that people have too much hope for this new president, Mr. Rouhani. He is considered a moderate, but I include in my written testimony some declassified intelligence over the past years on the CIA's assessment of past Iranian presidents who were considered moderate, Rafsanjani and Khatami in particular. And they are noting at the time that while these people were moderate in some ways, their support for the nuclear program and their support for terrorism waned not one bit. And that indeed, if there were a president who might be inclined to tamper down support for terrorism, which doesn't seem to be the case, but if there were such a president, the president would not have the authority to do it, only the supreme leader would. That's what this guy
Let me just, because one of the reasons why I asked the question, because I think you're right in that regards, but there was a relationship prior to Hugo Chavez, and I'm nervous, and as well as the fact that, you know, when you look at Ahmadinejad, there was a lot of false promises he made to individuals there. For example, the $1 billion that he promised to Daniel Ortega, that Daniel Ortega never got. You know, and I think one of you testified to the fact that there's new leadership that's being elected in Central and South America, and the new leadership will look at some of those issues, I think, also. And could that cause them to look at differing the ties, those that even may have ties now with Iran? What do you think? Give me your thoughts on that, Mr. Farnsworth.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your continued leadership, Mr. Meeks, on Western Hemisphere issues as well. I think that's something that we are watching very carefully. What we saw is really interesting, for example, in Brazil. When the previous president, Lula da Silva, was in power, you saw a state visit of the Brazilian leader to Tehran in 2010. You saw some outreach that was certainly uncomfortable for the United States and other Western countries, if not counterproductive. But since the election of Dilma Rousseff a couple of years ago, she has changed Brazil's posture with reference to Iran. She's actually spoken out against the Iranian regime. And I think that is the type of thing we have to take seriously in terms of the Western Hemisphere. There are political changes underway. We don't know where Nicolas Maduro is going to take Venezuela, but he has a lot of very difficult domestic political issues he has to resolve right now. And I think we can assume that at least in the near term, he's not going to strike the same international posture with Iran that Hugo Chavez did, because he's got a lot of political difficulties at home he's got to deal with to solidify his own base. In my view, again, the reason why Iran took advantage, and I do put it that way on purpose, of the Venezuelan invitation into the Western Hemisphere to really bolster their presence, was they saw a target of opportunity. And for his own purposes, Hugo Chavez really wanted to portray himself and build himself as the anti-imperialist, anti-American, anti-Western country. And in order to do that, he had to make common cause with some real rejectionist powers around the world. And so he actively pursued the Iranians. They saw a target of opportunity. They went in, they've moved aggressively. Now we've got a leadership change in Caracas. We don't know what's going to happen, but we do have to watch it carefully. And I think we can look at similar changes that may be underway with other elections in the region. That's one reason, though, why I think it's so important that as a hemispheric community we continue to focus on democracy development, and one of those aspects...
With that, let me just, because I'm running out of time, democracy development, is there a role for the OAS in this and trying to help and work together?
Absolutely. And I think what happens when leaders, even if they're serially reelected, if they remain in power for year after year after year, that can deepen actually those relations with Iran that a new president may not in fact find in his or her interest. And so that change at the top through democratic processes, I think, is, first of all, on its face, an important aspect of democracy. But in the concept of national security, that also has important dividends to pay. And I think from that perspective, absolutely, the OAS has to be a part of that. And that's why I would like to see a more robust posture of the OAS toward things like election monitoring, democracy development and you've mentioned a couple countries, I would mention similar ones, but we're going through, we're approaching now another round of elections in the Western Hemisphere in many countries this year and next year. It's going to be really important that democracy and the electoral process remains clean, open, and transparent, and that the opposition has a legitimate chance to actually contest for those elections.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. I think the OAS is there to make the Senate look like an active body, but we shall see. My friend, my colleague, Chairman Salmon is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Okay, so the statutorily required report that State Department recently rendered says that the influence of Iran is waning in the Western Hemisphere. As I listen to the testimony given today, I sure don't sense that you echo that sentiment that it's waning. And so my first question would be, and I'm calling for speculation, okay? So you can't say, I can't speculate. I want you to speculate. Why the report that kind of glosses over everything? Why you know, why do you believe, what could be the motivation, or was it just that they looked at the wrong criteria? Anybody care to take it on?
My colleagues will be happy to throw me under the bus and let me go first. I asked the same question you did, and I asked a lot of people around town. And I'm convinced that this is an unexcusable, classic example of left-hand, right-hand. My understanding is that the people who wrote this report did not, in a timely manner, consult with people who would have the information. Those people, both within the department and elsewhere, are quite upset that they were not properly consulted. It's my understanding that the State Department as such, the building, does not agree with everything in this report. There are parts of the building that are quite upset with it. And those agencies and departments who have information that might have been able to be used in this report, I think, are quite annoyed. I no longer have my clearances. I didn't see the classified version, but the unclassified version appears to have been written by an intern.
By an intern.
By an intern. That is,
Hope it's an A student intern.
well, I wouldn't have given it an A. And
An incomplete?
I don't think it's complete.
Yeah.
And even the report itself indicates that some of the key points, the conclusion, if you will, that Iran's activities are waning, was itself put in the unclassified version at the very top under a section labeled assumptions.
Thank you. Anybody else? And I don't want to get you in any trouble, but I really am interested.
Well, listen, I don't think you're going to get any of us in trouble. But I would echo what Matt said. I think that the report obviously was written in a vacuum. I don't think that the authors physically met with probably some of the most important players in town who aren't going to typically, and I spent 33 years in government, so I've got a sense for how this stuff works. A lot of this can't be answered, in open emails and that kind of thing. You ultimately have to reduce them to classified reporting to respond to, to the questions or the inquiries that are coming in. So
kind of like garbage in, garbage out.
Well, there you go, left hand, right hand.
Right.
Another analogy. I just, I think it was poorly put together. I think it was done so. Just the unclassified piece of it. I've still got my clearances, but I don't have a direct need to know. So I did not read the classified side of this either. Suffice it to say, I think it was poorly written by unseasoned, probably analysts that contributed, and I would sense that there wasn't strong leadership involved as well. And again, I base that not on direct knowledge. It is very much speculation, but that's based on 33 years in government.
And that's what I asked for. Did you care to make a comment? Or okay, I have one other question. Given the many other ways in which Argentina is emulating Venezuela's behavior, including its crackdown on the independent press, on the judiciary, its uncompensated nationalization of private assets, its defiance of U.S. and international legal judgments, its warming relations with other rogue nations, how far do you think Argentina is willing to go to work with Venezuela to continue increasing Iran's ability to evade sanctions?
Well, I think the question should be not only Argentina, but how far is Ecuador going? How far is Bolivia going? How far is Paraguay going? And in my mind, I think you can take this back to, pre-9/11, the pre-9/11 era, when we packed up Southcom and moved from theater. We moved Southcom to Miami, and Miami's a wonderful place. Miami is a wonderful place, and just recently visited again. But we don't have, and then couple that, Mr. Salmon, with the fact that post 9/11, well over 60% of our military's detection and monitoring assets packed up and moved to other parts of the world, and they've never returned. And you had a diminished, or I should say a decreased level of federal law enforcement presence in theater and our intelligence services, because they also went to other parts of the world. And look at what's happened. I mean, should this be any surprise to anyone? I think not. But it's something that I believe we can turn around. I don't think it would cost us an enormous amount of money to do. But I'll tell you, we'd better get focused on this at some very high levels before it bites us in the posterior.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. Mr. Deutsch is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And Madam Chairman, if it's okay, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter my opening remarks
Without
into the
objection.
record. Thank you to the witnesses for coming and staying. One of my concerns about Iran's role in the region is that it's increasingly attempting to use the relationships there as a mechanism for circumventing sanctions. and I'm increasingly concerned about Ecuador, which I don't think we've had a chance to discuss yet today. Not only has Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa repeatedly reaffirmed his support for Iran, but Ecuador and Iran have attempted to establish illicit banking channels, and perhaps most importantly, Ecuador's currency is the dollar. So our Iran sanctions regime has gone to great lengths to ensure that Iran does not have access to the dollar, but essentially any trade with Ecuador has the potential to undermine that. Therefore, given that we know that Iran often fails to follow through on their public promises, how significant is their bilateral trade, number one? What impacts could that have on our sanctions regime, and what should the U.S. be doing now to stop that? And I would throw that out to any of you that would like to answer.
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Deutsch, and let me simply say, if I can, that I think this has been one of the most troubling aspects of Iran's entry into the Western Hemisphere, if you want to put it that way, the ability or the effort to evade international sanctions, no question about it. I would point to some of the financial issues that you did. I would point to the offers of gasoline from Venezuela, which would clearly be in violation of international sanctions against Iran. And more importantly, even than that, in my view, is the political imprimatur that relations with some of the countries in Latin America has given the Iranian regime as a legitimate global player. And this is a real problem when you're trying to create an international regime in the political science sense, or an international institution of sanctions against a certain country, to have other countries that willfully go out of their way to try to create avenues to break those sanctions. And I think some of the things you pointed to, we have seen reports of financial relations with Ecuador, and we've seen certainly some sanctions that the U.S. government has taken against financial entities in Ecuador as well. I think those have to be watched very, very carefully. I haven't seen the classified information around some of those activities, but I would suggest that the ability to circumvent some of the international sanctions by Iran certainly is one of the most troubling aspects of this whole scenario.
And before seeking your input, gentlemen, just to follow up a bit, in 2008, the Central Bank of Ecuador agreed to accept $120 million in deposits from the Export Development Bank of Iran, which Treasury sanctioned for advancing Iran's WMD programs. Excuse me, in 2012, another state-owned Ecuadorian bank opened corresponding accounts with sanctioned Iranian banking institutions through a state-owned Russian bank. There have also been discussions of clandestine selling of the Ecuadorian bank to sanctioned Iranian banks. Obviously, this is all incredibly disconcerting, but the question is whether this type of behavior is a trend that we should anticipate. Iran trying to move into the region, and what we've seen here in Ecuador, should we expect that they're going to try to replicate that throughout the region?
Yes, in a nutshell. Ecuador may be unique because of the nature of the regime's interest in sticking its finger in Washington's eye, and because it's based on the dollar. But we should expect to see more of this. The good news is that we actually have a whole lot of tools at our disposal for trying to deal with such behavior, up to and including 311 action. And 311 action can be used, by the way, not only against a bank, as it's been used in the past, it can be used against a jurisdiction, it can be used against a country, it can be used against a part of a country, it can be used almost against any type of entity you can imagine. So there are lots of ways, and before you use it, of course, it's diplomatic leverage to say that you are considering such use. That would be devastating and for the country in question, and so there are lots of ways to go about trying to convince them to change their behavior.
Mr. Braun?
You know, I would, I think a bit more forcefully just add to what I said earlier. I mean, what's happening in Ecuador is not uncommon. We're seeing it play out through not only all of Latin America, or much of Latin America, but we're also seeing it play out in West Africa, North Africa, throughout Europe now. I don't want to, listen, I'm the former federal narcotics guy on this panel, and I don't want to oversimplify it. But, sir, you missed a little bit earlier my opening comments. I mean, the Hezbollah is now responsible for generating hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, contraband revenue each year, because of their expanding and growing involvement in the global cocaine trade. And all of the places that I've just discussed Not strangely, it's pretty evident in my eyes after 33 years in this business, it lines up perfectly. And you know, when you factor in some other things that I've mentioned here, you know, the concurrent growing expansion of Quds Force and Hezbollah. Let's never forget that it was the Quds that stood them up. They came up with the concept, they stood them up, they developed them, they've nurtured them over many, many years. And many experts now believe that it is the Quds that actually manage and direct some of the Hezbollah's more sophisticated activities around the globe. You know, it is all part and parcel of this growing confluence between the international drug trade and other transnational criminal activity and terrorist organizations. The President himself has remarked about this on several occasions recently, that he and the White House have seen this growing confluence, and you know, we have to do a better job at again driving a wedge between these very powerful forces as they come together. We're drifting further apart, the good guys, quite frankly, in this town. You've got counter-narcotic strategies, you've got counterterrorism strategies, and the two are not interlocking. The funding streams are absolutely separated. There are no singular funding streams. We've got to have interlocking strategies, we've got to have singular funding streams. As they grow closer together, we're drifting further apart. It needs to get turned around.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. And so pleased to turn to Mr. Duncan, who, as we had pointed out, was the author of the bill that called for this report. Mr. Duncan is recognized.
Isaiah 5:20. What are those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter? I believe the State Department failed in its mission given to them by a bipartisan effort of Congress signed into law by President Obama. I believe there was a preconceived or a predetermined conclusion, and that justified the methods in their report. So I've got a few questions, and bear with me, and I'll start with Mr. Braun. Hezbollah was primarily formed in what country? Michael?
You know, Iran, but
primarily Lebanon.
Lebanon, but suffice it to say that it was Iran that managed and directed every bit of that through the Quds Force, the Iran Special Forces, the elite folks that are responsible for global clandestine operations.
So it's Iranian proxy, primarily formed in Lebanon back in the late 70s, early 80s, and has been active ever since. So the tri-border region, primarily a hub for activity of what known foreign terrorist organization?
You have had long-standing interest on the part of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Al-Qaeda, and others in the tri-border area, the Western Hemisphere's usual suspects, the FARC, the Sendero, and others. But you know, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Hamas have been at work in the tri-border area, not for years, but they've been down there for decades.
Okay. AMIA bombings, the plan and the op was hatched and carried out from where? And Dr. Levitt?
Lebanon, Iran, and then in Argentina, the tri-border area.
Tri-border area, okay. When I met with the Paraguayans in the tri-border region, they showed and shared with us the Hezbollah activity, and as well as the Lebanese travel documents that allowed Lebanese individuals to come into the tri-border region and change out or forge or change their identity and actually travel throughout the South American region, okay? Dr. Levitt, you mentioned in a statement on July 9th, Homeland Security hearing that you couldn't attend because you were in Europe, convincing the European Parliament to do the right thing and name Hezbollah as a foreign terrorist organization, which thankfully they've done in the last 2 weeks. I'm going to enter, if without objection, his testimony to the Homeland Security Committee written July 9th.
Without objection,
Thank you,
subject
Madam
to the
Chairman.
length limitation and the rules.
Okay. On page 8, Dr. Levitt, you say that you mentioned the Hezbollah activity in Latin America, and you specifically reference, in at least one instance, a highly trained Hezbollah operative, Mahmoud, pronounced that wrong, Youssef Karani, succeeded in sneaking across the border in the U.S. through Mexico in the trunk of a car. Karani paid the owner of a Lebanese cafe in Tijuana $4,000 to smuggle him across the border in February 2001. The cafe owner, and I'm not going to pronounce his name, admitted to assisting more than 300 Lebanese sneak into the U.S. in similar fashion over a 3-year period. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, we know or we believe that there are Iranian government officials in the U.S. right now. Some of them are spies for Iran's Ministry of Intelligence Security, or MOIS. Others may be members of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard, IRGC, or Quds Force. Indeed, IRGC members assigned to the Iranian mission at the United Nations in New York have repeatedly been expelled from this country for conducting pre-operational surveillance of potential terror targets. So in light of what the State Department did or did not say in their assessment that the Iranian threat in the Western Hemisphere is waning, what action do you believe that the state should take to mitigate this threat? And I ask that to Dr. Levitt and to Mr. Braun.
There are lots of different things that can and should be done. The first is, I think there's a need for a scrub of the next report that delves into these issues a lot more carefully. But there are lots of other things that can be done, and we should be trying to come at this through multiple different angles. The current report, in the current report, the State Department stressed its success at leveraging diplomatic relationships, and that's not to be scoffed at. There's a lot that can be done by working with allies to make this region less hospitable to groups like the Quds Force or Hezbollah.
Let me ask you this. Did it surprise you that the State Department didn't even talk to any of the allies in this region?
It did. It did. It should not just be a diplomatic effort, though. Mike can tell you better than I. There is so much that can be done at the law enforcement level in terms of cooperation on counter-narcotics or other things. And I'll give you a tangible example that gets back to the AMIA case that we've centered this testimony around. After the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, nothing was done all that serious. And then less than 2 years later, the AMIA Jewish Community Center was bombed as well. One of the things that the U.S. government and some of the leadership here was from state counterterrorism at the time, took it upon itself to lead through law enforcement and intelligence channels something that became known as Operation Double Tap. Operation Double Tap didn't involve the T-word terrorism, and it didn't involve the H-word Hezbollah. It just involved us working with our allies, their intelligence and law enforcement services with ours, to identify bad actors. Almost every single one of them is also involved in all kinds of criminal activity, whether it's in the tri-border, as you said, or elsewhere, the human smuggling case you cited, or many, many others, and simply Al Caponing them and trying them for tax evasion, for example, or other things. And it was very successful. It was disruptive to their activities. And in some cases, we actually saw people from South America leaving the region, even if they weren't themselves targeted, but because the pressure was getting too hot, and going elsewhere, for example, to Africa. So there's lots of different tools in our toolbox. And I can't tell you what we are or not doing, because that's classified, and it's not that I know and can't tell you. I don't know anymore. But this report doesn't suggest to me to reflect the reality as I understand it.
And it's time, Mr. Braun.
Now, Mr. Duncan, you've heard me say this before. I think, first and foremost, the most important thing we've got to do is, again, demand interlocking counter-narcotics / transnational criminal activity strategies with counterterrorism strategies. You've got departments and you've got agencies in this town that are attempting to address both threats, and they're not even talking internally, much less externally. There are strategies that are developed and have been developed routinely over the past few years. As an example, focused on Latin America, a counter-narcotics strategy for Latin America that doesn't even mention the word terrorism anywhere. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, for God's sakes, the case study has been around since 1964. There are state sponsorship, the Soviet Union, or the old Soviet Union, comes apart at the seams. That funding stream dries up almost overnight, and what they had been fundamentally opposed to, diabolically opposed to, and that was getting involved in the cocaine trade. Literally, they made a decision unanimously, the FARC Executive Secretariat, with less than 5 minutes of discussion in the early 1990s, that they were making a monumental change. It was the only way they were going to keep their movement alive. And as we continue to successfully prosecute the global war on terror, that may not be politically correct these days, but as we continue to press hard on the global war on terror, you're going to see more and more of these groups. They are left with no choice. They have got to, and they will, inevitably turn to transnational criminal activity, organized crime, to keep their movements alive. That's what Hezbollah is doing, Hamas, Abu Sayyaf. You can go right down the line. Well over 70–75% of all of the designated foreign terrorist organizations are now involved in this activity, and we're not doing enough to turn it around. A couple of other things real quick. We've got to break our obsession with developing strategies to defend the 1-yard line, meaning our southwest border and our northern border. We can't take our eyes off of them, but we need to get more resources downrange, like I talked about earlier, so that we can counter these threats when they're 1,000 miles out, rather than when they're on our border, or God forsakes, we've already talked about this, inside our border. The threat is already inside of our border. Let's gate it off, let's fence it off as best we can and get a handle on this situation. And then finally, and this is extremely important, we've really got to revitalize a focus on the traditional threats. If our federal law enforcement and state and local counterparts and our foreign counterparts, as Matt was saying, got refocused on drugs, guns, money, humans, counterfeiting, extremely important, counter-corruption, those kinds of things take our law enforcement headlong straight into terrorist operatives and the organizations that they represent. And we've seen that play out time and time again with the DEA investigations over the past few years that I've talked about and that Matt's talked about many times, and certainly that you all know about. Thank you
for that. The chairwoman's been very gracious with time, but I'll remind the committee of Isaiah 5:20. We've got to be able to talk about the enemy of this country and this war on terror. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Amen. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience. You have been incredible witnesses. Not only was your testimony just so on point, but you were gracious enough to wait for us to do the people's business, and for that we thank you. And I have every confidence that with the leadership of Matt Salmon and Albio Sires, we will finally get the State Department to come and testify in an open setting on the issue of Iran's influence in the Western Hemisphere. May it be thus. Mr. Deutsch and I say, muchas gracias. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.